So the next talk is about to start. If people in the back want to kind of move up to the front, so people coming in a little bit later have seats in the back, that'd be great. Thanks. All right, thanks. So we're going to be moving on into our second talk now. My name is Gabriel Lang. I'm a second-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. Our next research paper speaker is Etan Green, who is a PhD candidate at Stanford. His talk today is going to be called, "What Does It Take to Call a Strike? 3 Biases in Umpire Decision-Making." The talk will be for 20 minutes, and then we'll have 5 minutes of Q&A, which we'll take off to the side. So please join me in welcoming Etan to the stage.
So thanks for that warm introduction. So first I'd like to acknowledge my co-author, my esteemed co-author David Daniels, who's here in the first row. David, would you take a bow, please? So what does it take to call a strike? So if you've watched a baseball game on TV in any of the past 7 years, you've seen something like K-Zone on the left or Fox Track on the right, where the location of the pitch as it crosses the plane that rises from the front of home plate is rendered with respect to the official strike zone. So this creates potentially some awkward moments, some angry moments as a fan. If you see a pitch go well outside the box and be called a strike, or a pitch that's well inside the box and called a ball. And so naturally this has engendered some measure of debate. Should we have home plate umpires at all if we can call balls and strikes more accurately with machines? So far, the nature of this debate has centered around the fact that umpires are inconsistent, that they're human, that they may be thinking about dinner, or they may blink when a 98-mile-an-hour fastball comes whizzing by them, and as a result, they blow the call. But what we're going to show is that umpires don't just make calls, or don't just blow calls randomly and occasionally. They blow calls systematically and predictably. Umpires are supposed to call balls and strikes based solely on the location of the pitch. But they don't. Umpires avoid making pivotal and visible calls. The strike zone expands in 3-ball counts, it contracts in 2-strike counts, and it contracts again when the last pitch in the at-bat was a called strike. These effects aren't just statistically significant, they're significant for the effect on the game. About once a game, an at-bat ends in something other than a strikeout after a 3rd strike should have been called. We're going to show you that these effects aren't just limited to a couple rogue umpires, a couple bad apples, but they're universal, that every single umpire is biased. Third, we're going to show you that this umpire bias is probably hard to fix. And fourth, there are things that hitters and pitchers could do to exploit these biases, but they don't. So here are the questions. I've given you the answers. We're going to go through one by one, and I'll provide you the evidence. So how are umpires biased? So here is the empirical strike zone. Let me walk over here to orient you. So on the plane, we have that plane that I mentioned before, the plane that rises from the front of home plate. On the right axis here in the red, that's the width of home plate, the width of the official strike zone. On the left axis, the red delineates the normalized distance between basically the batter's chest and right below his kneecaps. If you were an umpire, you'd be looking straight down through this plane over the catcher's head and towards the pitcher. What rises from the plane here in the mesh is the estimated probability, estimated over 1 million pitches, the probability of a called strike for any location in the plane. So a couple things to note. First, if a pitch is right down the center of the plate, right down the middle of the strike zone, it goes to the top of this mesh plot, and it's called a strike in excess of 99%. It's an obvious strike, and it's always called a strike. Where the mesh plot on the periphery here folds into the plane, these are obvious balls, and they're always called balls. But in the middle here is a region of uncertainty. And in this region, basically pitches are sometimes called balls and sometimes called strikes, even though they come at the same location. So what we're going to do is we're going to create 2 of these plots, 2 of these strike zones, one for when a given state is true, and one for when that state is false. One for when there are 3 balls, say, and one for when there are fewer than 3 balls. Now, it shouldn't matter whether there are 3 balls or not. The only thing that should matter is the location of the pitch as it crosses that plane. So these 2 strike zones should be the same. But what we see is that they're different. So here, this is the same plane at the bottom, and I've rendered the strike zone in this rectangle at the bottom of the plane. On the z-axis is the difference in the probability of a called strike between when there are 3 balls and when there are fewer than 3 balls. This should be flat, but instead it's a ring of mountains. And it's a ring of mountains that's particularly steep at the top and the bottom of the strike zone. So for instance, we see an increase in the probability of a called strike, an expansion of the strike zone of about 10 percentage points at the top and the bottom. These are places where calls are ordinarily, without 3 balls, called strikes about 50% of the time. They're 50-50 calls, they're borderline pitches. But when there are 3 balls, the probability of a called strike rises 10 percentage points to about 60-40. So 50-50 pitches become 60-40 calls. Here we see the same difference, but for 2 strikes. And we see the opposite phenomenon. It's a moat instead of a ring of mountains. And it's a moat that is, again, particularly deep at the top and the bottom of the strike zone. So just to orient you, where there are obvious strikes in the center of the strike zone, there's no difference. Obvious strikes are still called strikes when there are 2 strikes. And obvious balls on the periphery are still called balls when there are 2 strikes. But for borderline pitches, basically at the edge of the official strike zone, we see a deep depression. And so 50-50 calls, ordinarily, with fewer than 2 strikes, now with 2 strikes become basically 30-70 propositions. And I should say that this is for the average umpire. This is for all million data points, all umpires in our sample combined. If you do this for particular umpires, you can find places in their strike zone where borderline pitches become certain balls. Pitches that they're calling ordinarily strikes 50% of the time, they are calling balls every time with 2 strikes. Finally, this is our third bias. So this is when the last pitch in the at-bat was a called strike, and we see a uniform contraction in the strike zone, about at its largest 15 percentage points. So I've presented evidence that, generally speaking, umpires are averse to calling 4th balls. They avoid calling 3rd strikes. Perhaps they're even afraid of calling a 2nd strike in a row. We want to see if these effects are basically driven by a couple rogue umpires, or if they're universal to all umpires. So to do that, let's start with one umpire strike zone for right-handed batters. And so these plots are contour plots. They're essentially what you would see if you look straight down at the mesh plot that I showed you initially. Each contour represents points on the plane for which the probability of a called strike is the same. So on the left diagram, the 0.9 contour in the very center represents locations on the plane where the probability of a called strike is 90%. So this is the same umpire, mind you, but they're 2 separate strike zones. So on the left, we have the umpire strike zone in what I'll call the baseline state, when there are fewer than 3 balls, fewer than 2 strikes, and the last pitch wasn't a called strike. So basically, when none of our biases are in effect, and the strike zone looks pretty unbiased. In the very center, he's calling pitches strikes almost all the time, and on the periphery, he's basically not calling pitches strikes at all. Now contrast that with the right diagram, when there are 2 strikes in the count. There are a number of deformations here, but the most striking, perhaps, is just the general shrinkage in the strike zone. To the extent that the innermost contour line here, the 70% contour line, essentially overlaps with the 90% contour line in his baseline state. So that pitches with 2 strikes that he's calling strikes 70% of the time, with fewer than 2 strikes, he's actually calling those pitches strikes 90% of the time. So let me formalize a way to come up with a measure of the shrinkage or the expansion. And this is basically a visual heuristic. There is considerably more math in the actual estimation, which is in Appendix B, if you're interested. So here I have the baseline strike zone that I showed you before. And here what I'm going to do in blue is just highlight the 50% contour line. So the 50% contour line is interesting in the sense that it's his indifference point, the umpire's indifference point between calling balls and strikes. At these locations, he calls pitches strikes 50% of the time, and he calls them balls 50% of the time. Now, let me overlay in red the 50% contour line from his 2-strike state. These lines should overlap. They should be the same. There shouldn't be any difference between his baseline strike zone and his 2-strike strike zone, but as we saw on the previous slide, there is quite a difference. And these 2 contour lines show the nature of that difference. Basically, instead of overlapping, the red contour line is fully encompassed by the blue one, and it basically tracks closest to the 70% contour line. And so this is what we're going to call a strike threshold, and we're going to say it's 70% here. And specifically, it's the rate at which he calls strikes in his baseline case for pitches that he's indifferent between in the two-strike case. So for this umpire, he calls strikes, for pitches that he calls strikes 50% of the time when there are 2 strikes on the batter, he calls those same pitches strikes 70% of the time when there are fewer than 2 strikes. So a strike threshold of 50% indicates that the umpire is unbiased in the associated state. A strike threshold of more than 50% indicates that the umpire is ball biased. He requires more certainty in order to call a strike, whereas strike thresholds less than 50% indicate that the umpire is strike biased. So here is just an illustration of the contraction in the strike zone. And so what do these strike thresholds imply about calls? So on the right, here's what I call the band of reversal. It's just the area between the blue and the red contour lines, and it represents locations in the plane where this umpire in his baseline state would have called strikes probably, and now probably calls balls. So in expectation, it flips the calls. And notice that this band is really quite wide in some places. It reaches a width of about half a foot. So we do this for every umpire in a bunch of states. And so let me talk about a state first that I haven't described yet, the state in which the last pitch in the at-bat was a ball. And so here are distributions of umpire strike thresholds in each of those 4 states. And that state, that first state, when the last pitch in the at-bat was a ball, is this distribution that is tightly wrapped around the unbiased strike threshold mark. So I haven't talked about this state before, and I haven't talked about it for a reason, because it doesn't induce bias. In fact, umpires are essentially universally unbiased in this state, that their strike zones when the last pitch wasn't a ball are the same as their strike zones when the last pitch was a ball. Now, let's look at when the last pitch in the at-bat was a called strike. We see a similar distribution, but this distribution is right-shifted. It's this tall one on the right, and it's centered at about 0.6. So they have 60% strike thresholds. Their strike zones contract. They become ball-biased. Note, though, that the least ball-biased umpire in this state, at the very left of the distribution, is still to the right of the 50% strike threshold mark. The least biased umpire is still biased. Every umpire is biased. Similarly, when there are 2 strikes in the count, we get this other distribution on the right here at the bottom, the long dash, and we see the same thing, that the strike zone contracts, the umpires become ball biased, and the least biased umpire is still biased. 3 balls, something slightly different, a wider distribution, more dispersion, some quite biased umpires, but some umpires who achieve unbiasedness. To reiterate, when the last pitch in the at-bat was a called strike, or when there are 2 strikes in the count, every umpire is biased, every single one. Now, this might prompt the question, if there are biases, can these biases be fixed? And the answer to that question depends on what the nature of the bias is. So there are generally 2 types of biases. There's intuitive bias. Intuitive bias is when you don't think about a decision too much, you rely on your intuition, you make a snap judgment, and you make an error. Deliberative bias is where you take too long, you think too much about your decision, you incorporate extraneous information, and you make a poorer decision than you would have if you had less time to make that decision. So intuitive bias is particularly hard to fix because our intuitions have evolved over 10,000 years, and they're really hardwired into us. So we're going to arbitrate between these 2 classes of explanations by looking at how umpires operate under time pressure. And I'll talk about on the next slide how time pressure applies to umpires in particular. But for now, if time pressure strengthens the biases that we've identified, then we have evidence that intuitive bias is at work, that they're making snap judgments. But if time pressure weakens the biases, then it's really deliberative bias at work, that they're taking too much time to make their decision, they're bringing in extraneous information, and they're making the wrong call. If they just had less time, they'd make the right call. So where does time pressure affect umpires? How does it affect umpires? So most of the time, umpires really aren't under any kind of time pressure. The pitcher throws the pitch, the catcher catches it, and the umpire rises out of his stance and says, strike, or ha, or he rises out of his stance and says nothing to indicate a ball. But about 1% of the time, the umpire has to render his call verbally and immediately to instruct the catcher whether he may need to make a play on a base runner. In these situations, the constraints on them are pretty inside baseball, but generally they happen when there are 3 balls in the count, and so a ball would walk the batter, and when there's a runner on first, and so that walked batter would then advance the runner. So how does time pressure affect the biases? So I'm showing you 2 biases here and the effect on time pressure, and the y-axis is the change in the probability of a called strike for borderline pitches. So for pitches that are normally 50-50 calls, that are called strikes 50% of the time. And so we see that with 3 balls in the count without time pressure, the probability of a called strike rises about 8 percentage points, and so 50-50 calls become basically 58-42 calls. However, with time pressure, the bias exaggerates. These calls become basically like 61-39 calls. Now, on the right, the full count bias. So we can't test the 2-strike bias with time pressure in isolation because time pressure implies 3 balls. And so what we do is we test the bias that's induced by 2 strikes and 3 balls, which happens to be a full count. And so the full count bias is qualitatively similar to the 2-strike bias in the sense that it contracts the strike zone. And so here we see that 50-50 calls basically become about 39-61 calls without time pressure. But with time pressure, pitches that are ordinarily called strikes half the time are now called strikes only a third of the time. So again, time pressure exaggerates the biases. So in both cases, time pressure strengthens the biases, which suggests an intuitive explanation, and that biases may probably be hard to fix. So finally, I want to talk about ways that players can exploit these biases and whether they do. And the answer is they don't. Sorry. Okay, so hitters should swing less often when the last pitch was a called strike. So why is that the case? So to remind you, on the left we have the last strike bias, and the last strike bias is a more or less uniform deflation in this moat-shaped pattern, right? And so this suggests that if you're up at the plate and the last pitch was a called strike, well, if the next pitch is a borderline call, it's less likely to be a strike. So you probably on the margin should lay off of it. So on the right, when we look at the difference in the swing rate across the plane when the last pitch was a called strike versus when it was not, we should see a similar moat-shaped formation. That at borderline pitches, they should be more likely to lay off, to not swing. But we see a flat plane. We don't see any difference. Second, when there are 2 strikes on the hitter should be more willing to protect the sides of the plate than the top and the bottom. Why is that? Because the 2-strike bias is asymmetric. At the top and the bottom, the pitcher is really unlikely to get that 3rd strike call, whereas he's more likely to get it on the sides. Therefore, the hitter should be protecting the sides. Do we see any evidence of that? On the right, no. For pitchers, the 3-ball bias is asymmetric as well. It's greatest in the top and the bottom of the strike zone. So if you're a pitcher and there are 3 balls in the count and you want to get a strike, well, on the margin, if you're going to throw a borderline pitch, you should locate it towards the top and the bottom rather than the sides. Do pitchers do that? No. Finally, the 2-strike bias again for pitchers. Pitchers should be locating their pitches with 2 strikes on the sides of the strike zone rather than top and the bottom in order to get that called 3rd strike. That's where the bias bites least, but they don't. So to recap, umpires avoid making pivotal and visible calls. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this presentation, it's to have these images seared into your retina. I've shown them enough times. Second, bias flips calls on borderline pitches. Remember the band of reversal. Third, every umpire is biased, every single one. Fourth, umpire bias is probably hard to fix because it's intuitive in nature. Hitters can exploit these biases, but they don't. And finally, pitchers can exploit these biases, but they don't. Great. So thank you so much. I'd be happy to take questions. David, do you want to come on stage?
So we'll take questions up here.
I thought this was great analysis. Thank you very much. I just wondered a couple of things, like two things about sort of the game. I wonder what you think of, like, the role that batters' different heights play in the calls.
Oh yeah, so the strike zones are normalized by the height of the batter, so the data are incredibly rich. I mean, now that we're in the sports view landscape, I think people look at like the pitch effects data and they think this is like passe. But not only do we have the location of each pitch on this plane, but the operator of the camera basically looks at a picture of the batter from center field, and he identifies the top of his strike zone, the bottom of his strike zone. And so all the pitches are normalized by that distance.
Oh, okay. And the second thing, what about people swinging at pitches when the last strike has been called, or when there are two strikes? Like, because obviously, only if the pitch goes by does the umpire have to make a call.
Oh, so when we're showing you what hitters can do about these biases, the plots on the right are the swing rates. So it's about whether they swing or not, and then if they don't swing, the umpire makes his call. Is that clear? So there's no selection effect in those plots.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Hey, I thought the research was great. I guess my question is, if you expand on your theory that the reasoning for this bias is umpires trying to avoid having a major impact or be more visible.
Yep.
Obviously with balls and strikes, there's a lot of data there, huge sample size, and you know the correct answer. But do you think, would your hypothesis extend beyond calling balls and strikes into, and are there specific plays where you think that this bias probably exists a lot more than other plays?
So are you asking where in baseball may this expand, where in sports may this expand, or more generally where in life may this expand?
Probably all three, but I was more thinking like in baseball, safe versus out versus, or checked bats, or are there specific plays in baseball where you think this is a huge issue but might not be as measurable?
Yeah, so why don't I talk about baseball, and then maybe David can talk about real life, for which he is the expert and not I. So there's a famous play where Armando Galarraga was basically an out away from a perfect game, and there was a ground ball, and Armando Galarraga was covering the base, and Jim Joyce, the first base umpire, declared the runner to be safe, so to break up his perfect game at the very last out, and he blew the call. It was totally wrong, and we tend to remember he made the wrong pivotal call in like the most pivotal moment. But I think those are the exceptions that we tend to remember, and I think for borderline calls, probably in those cases, though we don't have data on this, I would speculate that if you had better data on how those calls generally go, they probably generally go in the other direction.
Okay, and just spend 10 seconds on talking about possible implications for other refs and other decision makers. We think this does have implications, and I think the stories that are about people are afraid of getting pivotal calls wrong apply very broadly, and visible calls as well. And this connects to a large literature in psychology and economics about loss aversion, and it's not in the presentation, but we think that's what's going on. And so because it connects to that literature, that actually makes us more confident that even umpires are doing similar things for other types of calls they make beyond ball and strike calls.
Yeah, I should also say that our interpretation isn't exclusive. So Cass Sunstein, who's the law professor at Harvard, he argues that what's going on is actually mercy bias, that umpires are being merciful to players that are behind.
I thought this was great, thank you. I may have just missed this, apologies if I did. Early on, when you have the diagrams displaying 2-strike and 3-ball bias, are those including or excluding full counts? So in other words, are they presenting both a 2-ball and 3-ball and 2-strike bias concurrently, or are they factored out?
Yeah, so they're conservative in the sense that they're including full counts. Yeah, and the full count bias is in the middle of them, so it's
do you have any evidence or just anecdotal? How much more extreme would it have looked if you had excluded full counts?
Yeah, so I think I'm trying to remember exactly the numbers in the paper, but so the best estimates for what the nature of the bias is come from the semi-parametric model. So those are fully non-parametric plots that we're just taking the difference of. But we have a semi-parametric model in Appendix A that basically estimates the change that happens for borderline pitches. So of the type of analysis we showed you for the time pressure analysis. And so in 3-ball counts, basically, so 50-50 calls become 58-42 calls. 2-strike counts, it's a 19 percentage point decrease. So it's 50-50 calls become 31-69 calls. And I think it's 17 percentage points for last strike.
You're excluding full counts now.
Right, and so full count, the interaction effect is small. And so basically to get the full count, you can just add the 3-ball and the 2-strike bias. Basically comes out to about 11 or 12 percentage points decrease. Mm-hmm.
I just want to add one quick thing. So all of the estimates we presented in the presentation are averages. And so Eitan mentioned this in the presentation, but there are some umpires, and we know who they are, for whom borderline pitches become certain balls under the 2-strike bias. And so all umpires are biased, but not all are equally biased. Some are much better, and some are much worse.
That's all the time we have for this presentation. Thanks again.
We'll be here in case you guys want to ask more.